Today, I'm going to talk to you about building machine learning services and what happens when your machine learning model is actually a core component of your software product and the different considerations that you have to take into account when you're putting machine learning into production. In my former life, I was a scientist doing research in computational biology and genomics. And one of the questions that really interested me was how biological systems were able to adapt to changing environments, otherwise known as evolution. And in particular, what I was fascinated by was this concept of evolvability. So there's evolution and there's evolvability, which is a system that gives it the ability to evolve new adaptations in response to a changing environment. So most of you probably are already aware that adaptation maximizes an organism's fitness for their environment. But sometimes being really well adapted to your current environment actually reduces your ability to evolve to future changes. For example, the Canada lynx on the left and the bobcat on the right both prefer to eat snowshoe hares. That's their main prey. In the case of the Canada lynx, it almost exclusively preys on this organism when the snowshoe hare species when possible. And it's developed several adaptations to really optimize for hunting snowshoe hares. It has large paws that allow it to walk on the snow, and so it can chase after hares that run away. And it's also active at the same times that the snowshoe hare is awake. The bobcat also likes to eat snowshoe hares when it's available, but it's not able to walk on the snow. So if it can't catch the hare on its first pounce, then it's not really able to chase after it. As a result, in areas where you find both of these species, the Canada lynx usually outhunts the bobcat. But the bobcat, on the other hand, has a wider habitat range and a wider diet as well. The Canada lynx mostly lives up north in the Americas, but the bobcat can be found as far south as Florida. And instead of just living in these like snowy forests, you can find them in swamplands and deserts and even suburban backyards. Even though it prefers to eat hares and rabbits, it can also feed on rodents, birds, and even animals as large as deer or elk. So the Canada lynx is better adapted to its particular environment, but the bobcat has more evolvability. And with the effects of climate change, as the cold, snowy habitats of the Canada lynx starts getting warmer, the bobcat may end up actually outcompeting the Canada lynx. You can represent this through what's called like a fitness landscape. So on the y-axis is rising costs. So the lower you go, it's more fit. Higher you go, it's less fit. And a species like the Canada lynx has found the optimum position, like this arrow here. So this position is very stable, and organisms that are trying to increase their fitness are going to eventually move towards this position over time. A species like the bobcat, by contrast, is in a much less stable position and has lower fitness. On the other hand, environments don't stay steady. They will change over time. And you can get into this situation where actually this is no longer the most optimal position. And it's actually quite difficult for a species located here to incur the high cost of moving out of this space to find the new optimal position over here. Meanwhile, a species like the bobcat, which may be in a more unstable position, is also, as a corollary, able to explore the fitness landscape while incurring less cost and be able to potentially find this new fitness optimum. So you're probably wondering, okay, that's biology, but hopefully it hasn't seemed like a totally wild digression, and you can see where the obvious metaphor software development comes into play, because software systems also evolve in response to new requirements, and software engineers have to cope with the same trade-off between maintaining stability while also being flexible to change. So this evolvability trade-off that I've been describing is something that we all encounter as engineers. So neither one is automatically better than the other. You don't necessarily want complete stability or complete flexibility. Depending on your circumstances, maybe you might veer more in one direction versus the other. But really, as with all trade-offs, what you want to do is find the right sweet spot for your circumstances. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to call that sweet spot resilience. And by resilience, I mean a system that can perform all of its expected functions well, but can also adapt easily to changing conditions. So, a lot of the software best practices that we talk about, I think, are ultimately about managing this trade-off. For example, these adages like avoid premature optimization or being open to extension, but closed for modification, aka the open close principle. I think all of those are ultimately variations on how to find the right balance or how to find the right sweet spot for a resilient system. So this theme has occurred over and over in my career as I switched from research into technology. And my main interest while as a software engineer has been in building services for machine learning models. My last client project at Life was for title insurance company where they wanted to create a service to predict risk in claims being made on a title insurance policy. Since leaving A-Flight, I've joined a health tech nonprofit called Audere, and it has a mission to improve access to healthcare in low and middle income countries. Its key product is called Health Pulse AI, which it consists of computer vision models that can interpret photos of rapid diagnostic tests, also known as RDTs for short. By RDTs, you probably have seen them already. The at-home COVID tests that you use are examples of RDTs that all of us have used. But they also exist for other infectious diseases as well, including malaria, HIV, flu, and other diseases that are of importance to global public health. Audere builds software to deliver these models either as mobile apps or API services. And as a result, we're able to provide data to our partners on diagnostic trends that allow them to make better decisions about where to deploy their resources. So across these various machine learning projects, I've gotten to experience what it's like to develop infrastructure and software for machine learning models and keep them operating in production. And what stood out to me is that the trade-off that I've started off describing between stability and flexibility is particularly challenging for these kinds of projects. Machine learning development is a highly nonlinear process that requires having a stage for experimentation and exploration during every iteration. Meanwhile, when you're operating production software service, you're usually dealing with a linear sequence of releases and often have end users that have expectations of what the behavior of your software should be. Moreover, machine learning involves randomization at various stages, which means that it becomes more difficult to have reproducible and predictable behavior. I found this great diagram of the machine learning lifecycle online. And as you can see, like there is this constant cycling of getting data, developing a model, evaluating the model. And if it doesn't perform well, then you're going through this over and over again. And even when you do get a model that performs well on your test data and you get it into production, you may find that eventually it declines in performance or doesn't work the way you expect on real world data. And then you have to go back through this process all over again. So it's kind of like software prototyping in sort of more standard projects, but instead of going from prototype to a more standard mode of small incremental features and bug fixes, you basically have to go through the prototyping cycle for every single iteration, even for what eventually becomes a fairly minor update to the model. So given all of this instability, how do you find the right balance? What I've come to conclude is that the key to a resilient system is to find places in this life cycle that can be stabilized and then allow flexibility in the rest. In other words, introduce the right constraints via automation and standardization. Interestingly enough, you see the same pattern in biological systems as well by compartmentalizing what can not be easily changed from what can easily change in order for organisms to quickly evolve new features. In a machine learning system, I think the best places to focus on is for stability is what goes into the model training process and what comes out of the model training process. Let's start with what goes in. So every machine learning model requires you to prepare a set of data that is labeled with what the correct answer should be. This usually involves humans to painstakingly look through a set of unlabeled data and then assign it the right category. And then the model is trained on this labeled data so it can predict what the right answer should be on new data that it's never seen before. That's how it learns. And you also probably want to pull aside some of this label data for a validation set so that you can actually evaluate how well the model will do. You want to automate as much of this process as possible, from collecting the data to labeling it to partitioning it between training and validation and doing any quality checks that you need for the labeling process, especially if labeling requires a lot of special domain expertise, which it usually does if you're using machine learning to solve a meaningful problem. And then each of these steps also involves a lot of data transfer, sometimes across platforms or between organizations. People often use third parties to do the labeling rather than doing it in-house. So you'll need to pay special attention to make sure all the data formats and schemas are standardized. And finally, I want to emphasize the point that labeling, because it requires humans to review and process a lot of data, you can regard it in some sense as a product in and of itself. So treat it as not just an infrastructure problem, but a UX and UI problem, regardless of whether it's done in-house or by a third party, and make up the investment upfront to making that whole workflow efficient. Labeling can take up to 25% of the whole machine learning development process. So whatever you can do to optimize it will help. On my 8-Light project, we actually did build a custom front end just for labeling our data. And I think that was actually one of the keys to that project's success. All right, so the next area is data analysis. And if you've ever worked with data scientists, you know that the main tool of choice is a Jupyter notebook. For those of you who haven't seen one before, it's kind of like a GUI for a REPL, and it's really great for interacting with data and quickly generating visualizations. It's not so great when the notebook itself is treated like an app. And I've actually heard of many cases where, fairly large companies will run reporting and even ML models themselves off of a notebook. Please don't do that. The flexibility of Jupyter notebooks is that you can execute code blocks over and over again and even out of order, which is great for exploration. But that is also why it is very much not stable. You can't be sure that the notebook output you see will be the same every time. But it's a tool of choice for a good reason. And almost any machine learning platform, whether it be Google Colab or Databricks, has integrated either the Jupyter notebook or some clone of it into its development environment. And then IDEs like PyCharm and VS Code also have first-class support for notebooks as well. This ability to rapidly explore and experiment with data is key for ML services to be able to evolve. So how do you enable this flexibility while also providing stability for the final product that we hope to build? So this is another place where we need constraints, but I think it's important to use a light touch. And so here are some of the strategies that I've found useful. First of all, encourage your ML engineers and data scientists to check in their notebooks into version control. And not just the final notebook after they're done with their analysis, but any major update that they make as they do their analysis should be committed. Unfortunately, GitHub doesn't really have good support for visualizing the diffs on a Jupyter notebook, but you can use tools like MBDime to actually review those changes and have a useful commit history. For ad hoc analyses that are sort of done as one-offs, as I mentioned before, you can generate very different looking outputs depending on the order of execution in a Jupyter notebook. So it's important to take any static snapshots of the output itself. You can make a PDF of the whole notebook or save visualizations as PNGs, but take that snapshot and save it somewhere where it can be referenced in the future. Now, if any analysis does end up being something that you want to repeat instead of just doing it as a one-off, you should extract that into a common library with the same standards for any other software that you write. It should have test coverage and be under version control and be able to import those modules in any future notebooks rather than having your data scientists copy paste between cells across notebooks. Okay, so once we have a potential model, we want to be able to track and reference it against other versions of the model. And you might be thinking, oh, that's easy, just use semantic versioning. But despite all the best practices that we've established around software versioning, ML model versioning has proven to be a surprisingly complicated problem. But I think part of the problem is that what we call a model in modern machine learning is actually really not a singular model at all. Your input data needs to be processed and transformed into a structure that the model will understand. And then there are often pipelines of models so that the output of one becomes input for the other. And then finally, there's also some post-processing that makes sure that the model output is in a form that is actually interesting and usable for decision making. Each of these stages is a not inconsiderable amount of code that needs to be versioned and are also often worked on independently and updated at different times by ML engineers on the team. But all of it gets packaged together as a model whenever the service is being updated. So here are some practices that I've found to be useful. So first of all, keep a change log, and that change log should have specific Git hashes of every component of your model. Second, you should include all the models in your changelog, even the experimental ones, even the ones that show poor performance and never get deployed. It's because you'll invariably find that you're going to want to compare that not so great model against future versions of your model to get insight into what you want to try next. And also, it's just useful to record your failures so that you don't inadvertently end up repeating yourself and trying the same mistakes again. In addition to keeping the changelog itself updated, the version information should be bundled with the model itself. You should be able to query your ML service and know exactly what version of the model is deployed, and then be able to reference that with your changelog to know exactly which commit the code corresponds to. And then moreover, every time the service returns a prediction, you should make sure to include the version information as well so that you can trace back which version of the model is responsible for that particular response. And then in order for all of these to work, you need to not just have the right systems, but you also need a culture of documentation. And this should extend beyond just your software engineering team, but also to the ML engineers and any data scientists that you're working with. There are definitely tools that are out there to help manage all this versioning complexity. Examples are DBC, AWS SageMaker, but none of these can really replace the need for good documentation. Versioning ultimately is not just about what naming or numbering system you use, but keeping a good record of what changes you tried to and what the outcome was. Next challenge I think as software engineers, we've all heard the phrase, but it worked on my machine. Well, this problem extends to machine learning models as well, and then gets even more complicated. ML models tend to be black boxes. At a certain point, you can't really trace what happens to the input data as it goes through either multiple layers in a neural network or parallel trees in an ensemble algorithm. And so when a model gets deployed on a server and it doesn't behave in the exact same way that it did on an ML engineer's local machine, it can be next to impossible to debug exactly what the source of the difference is. So you want to reduce the possibility of that happening as much as possible. And that means, again, put in constraints. You want to make sure everyone is using the same versions of dependencies. Most of the popular ML frameworks are in Python, but those Python libraries are built on C and Fortran libraries, and those libraries can be very sensitive to which particular compiler parameters were used. There can also be subtle differences between platforms. Most engineers use Mac laptops, but most servers use Linux. And finally, the models themselves, they might be deployed on a server or be on a mobile device. Servers usually have x86 architecture, while mobile devices use ARM chips. This actually has, we've run into this issue a lot at Autoray, since our product offering includes both models on mobile apps and on server-based APIs. And when the two don't match, then there becomes this whole soul searching of where did they diverge? So what do we do? You've probably heard shift left on security. I like to sort of introduce the idea of shifting left on deployment when it comes to machine learning. Building infrastructure and tooling that makes it easier for ML engineers to not just work with models on their laptops, but be able to put them easily on a deployed environment, ensures that they can test that model in a setting that mimics production. And the earlier that they can do this deployment, the sooner we can identify any problems with reproducibility. So that means investing in really good CI/CD, investing in a lot of automation. And I would also encourage you to consider having a separate sandbox environment for your ML team so that they can deploy any models that they're currently evaluating. All the usual strategies that we have for reproducible builds and software apply here as well. So working with containers like Docker can ensure that an ML engineer is training his model under the same conditions as the model's deployed environment. Sometimes that's not always possible because very complex ML models may need to run on specialized machines, especially if they're taking advantage of GPUs for calculation. In that case, you can't use containers, but then you have to impose a lot of discipline around using shared virtual machine images. And that means, again, investing in automation and tooling so that it's easy to update those images and roll them out across dev servers. And then dependency management. Now, Python, unfortunately, is a language that's a little notorious for its problems with dependency management. Currently, the state of the art is to use tools like pip tools and poetry, which will generate dependency lists with hashes so that you can have reproducible builds. And then finally, as I mentioned, these models are kind of black boxes. So you usually want to have some form of testing to actually know whether you're having problems with reproducibility or not. So it's worth setting up some form of regression testing with known test cases where it's very clear what you expect the result to be so that you can tell immediately when the model is behaving differently. This isn't quite the same as evaluating the model's performance per se. You shouldn't use these test cases as your validation set, but it's still a good check to run through during your CI pipeline to make sure that your model isn't wildly different from what's expected. And that kind of leads us finally to, well, how do you measure the performance of a model? And this is an area that I have been especially interested in. And The whole experimental quality of machine learning development means that you need some form of feedback in order to know whether a model is good enough to be deployed or not, and whether the changes you're making is actually improving the model's performance or making it worse. And as with experiments, if you have any background in scientific research, you know that often it is worse. Key to measuring anything, you need to choose the right metric. Ultimately, every ML project I've been on ends up really relying on the confusion matrix. This shows you basically what the distribution of the actual labeled results looks like versus the predicted results. And basically, you ideally, a model that performs really well, all the cases will fall along the diagonal of this matrix. And then if you look at the off diagonal parts, you can see, well, which are the error cases that my model is prone to making. So for example, this model is very prone to mistaking versicolor for virginica. Now, when you present this confusion matrix to a business stakeholder, they're often going to be like, what does this even mean? So it also helps to have some sort of single dimensional value to compare across model versions. And there are a number of common metrics that are standardly used, things like precision, recall, F1, area under curve, log loss. And I would strongly recommend that even if you don't end up learning all the ins and outs of how machine learning works, it's worth spending the time to become familiar with what these metrics are and their respective pros and cons, because this will ultimately determine which models stop being experiments and become your next update to production. And some things to keep in mind. Most machine learning problems that I've dealt with have very imbalanced classes. So you may remember the 404 or error cases were actually really rare compared to the 200 cases, right? That's a really common scenario. Usually your model is trying to predict a relatively rare signal, and a negative result might be really common while the positive result happened rarely. But you can imagine then in such a scenario that you can train a model to always return negative, and under most of the standard metrics as is, they'll perform really well because they're only missing the very, very small number of positives. So you want to make sure that you use variants of these metrics that will account for imbalanced distribution if this is a key aspect of the problem you're trying to solve. And then next, typically when you build the software service around an ML model, you usually build it so that it returns one prediction at a time. That's not always the case, but that's often how the model is being used. But in order to measure across a whole validation set, it's really important to be able to support batch inference and have all the predictions for all the data sets be returned. And speaking from personal experience, I've always built that feature just a little too late and encountered a lot of pain until it got built. So learn from my mistakes and build it early on in the process and not when you're desperately needing it. And in addition to automating batch inference, you also want to automate the measurement process itself, calculating that whatever metric you've decided on for evaluating your model. If you can automatically log or snapshot the metric for every model version that's developed, you can speed up the whole feedback cycle and make this whole like messy, nonlinear ML development process much more efficient. As a corollary, it's also nice to, as part of this automation, to make it easy to compare the results across different model versions, because that will smooth the whole process of determining which model is the best to deploy to production, especially as the number of models you have proliferate and it becomes really hard to keep track of all the ones that are being considered. Another problem that often comes with measurement, sometimes you're really lucky and the starting label data that you're working with, it has been drawn from real world data. So it will look exactly like what your users will be likely to input. But other times you're not so lucky. And the metric that you get from model evaluation on just sort of your starting validation set may not actually reflect what the performance of the model will be that real world data. So, to the extent that is possible, you may need to put in some extra care to make sure that validation set resembles the same frequencies and distributions that you observe from your users. It's also important to not overuse the same validation set over and over again. The whole point of validation is to measure how the model will perform on new data that it's never been exposed to. But if you are constantly using the same validation set and feeding that back into the model development process, you can indirectly influence the model to become overfitted on the validation set. So it's important to be able to generate new validation sets and not expose too many details about it to the ML engineers if possible. And then finally, whatever metric that you use to evaluate whether a model should be promoted to production should also be used to monitor the performance of that model. And if you've done a good job of automating, it should actually be really straightforward to be able to build in observability for your ML service. All right, so in conclusion, I've presented some ideas around how you can ensure that you're building resilient ML services. You want to allow for the flexibility needed during data analysis and model deployment, but stabilize all the parts of the life cycle that go into and out of model training. Another sort of insight that I want to leave you with is that MLOps, this whole process of supporting a machine learning product, is also actually partly about developer experience as well. You want to look at all the workflows of your ML engineers and see where are the pain points that you can make easier. And that will enable the whole process to work more efficiently while also still having that room for exploration and experimentation that is necessary. And finally, it's really key to work in close collaboration with ML engineers and data scientists through all parts of this life cycle. You don't ever want to end up in a situation where they're throwing the model over the wall and you're just left with, okay, I'm going to figure out how to integrate this into my software. You want to be involved in every stage of the process and not have siloed teams.